The winter air over England was thick with the smell of oil and burning metal. It was 1944. The world was at war, and the sky itself had become a battlefield. Allied bombers roared above the clouds, hunted by German fighters and the deadly hum of anti-aircraft guns. Every mission meant death for dozens of young men, men who never returned, their planes swallowed by the endless gray. But in a small, forgotten hangar on the edge of a Royal Air Force base, one man was building something no one believed could exist. He wasn't a general, he wasn't a pilot, he wasn't even a soldier. He was an engineer, a dreamer, and his name was Reginald Denny. They called him mad, reckless, a fool chasing ghosts. Yet Denny had a vision, a flying machine that needed no pilot, no cockpit, no fear. A machine that could strike from miles away without risking a single human life. In 1944, he would prove to the world that the age of the unmanned aircraft, the drone, had already begun. But to do it, he would have to fight not just against the enemy, but against disbelief itself. Before the war, Reginald Denny was known not for building weapons, but for standing beneath the hot lights of Hollywood. A British actor with a charming smile, he played gallant heroes and daring pilots on screen. But when the cameras stopped rolling, Denny's true obsession began. In the quiet hum of his workshop, surrounded by gears, propellers, and the smell of glue. The world saw an actor, but behind those studio doors, he saw something else. A future where man and machine could work together, where risk could be replaced by invention. Denny had been a pilot himself in World War I. He knew the terror of flak bursting near the cockpit, the helplessness of watching a comrade vanish into smoke. So when the world slid into another war in 1939, he swore to build something that could save those young lives. Something that could fly, fight, and even die without a human heart beating inside it. He began small, toy-sized aircraft that could be guided by radio control. At first, people laughed. Military officers visiting his workshop in Los Angeles called them model planes for children. Denny didn't argue. He just watched them leave, then went back to work. Night after night, he fine-tuned the radio frequencies, reshaped the wings, and pushed his fragile prototypes into the sky above the California desert. Sometimes they crashed immediately. Sometimes they flew, briefly before spiraling into the sand. Every failure left his hands trembling, but his eyes never lost their fire. In 1936, he opened a small shop called the Reginald Denny Hobby Company. Hidden behind its humble storefront was something extraordinary. A lab where a handful of mechanics, dreamers, and tinkerers built miniature aircraft unlike anything the military had ever seen. They called their best creation the radio plane OQ-2, a pilotless aircraft made of plywood and steel, no larger than a motorcycle, that could be controlled from the ground by a radio signal. By 1940, as Europe burned, Denny brought his prototype to the U.S. Army. He told them his little plane could serve as a target drone, a moving flying practice target that would train anti-aircraft gunners for real combat. The generals were skeptical. No machine can fly itself, one said. And even if it could, why would we need it? Denny's hands shook with anger. He didn't shout. He didn't plead. He simply loaded his creation onto a truck, drove it out to a test field, and turned on the transmitter. The propeller whirred. The little craft lifted off the ground, steady and sure, climbing into the open blue. The generals watched in stunned silence as it banked left, then right, obeying every command. And when Denny cut the power, the drone descended gently back to Earth, landing itself. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine. That day, the U.S. Army ordered hundreds of his radio planes. What had begun as a toy became the first mass-produced drone in world history. But for Denny, that was only the beginning. He wasn't satisfied with target drones. He dreamed of something greater, a craft that could fly into enemy territory, gather intelligence, maybe even strike, all without risking a single human life. And yet, for every success, new enemies appeared: military bureaucracy, skeptical scientists, the belief that real war could never be fought by machines. They mocked him again, this time not as a dreamer, but as a threat to tradition. But Denny didn't stop. In his small hangar, surrounded by the roar of engines and the hiss of soldering irons, he worked in secret. He wasn't building toys anymore. He was building ghosts, flying ghosts that would one day change warfare forever. By 1944, the war had devoured everything: cities, families, and faith itself. The skies over Europe burned day and night, filled with thunder from engines and the wail of bombs falling toward nameless towns. Every mission meant another handful of young men never coming home. Pilots vanished into clouds of smoke, their names replaced by new recruits before the ashes cooled. The war machine demanded more bodies, more sacrifice, more blood. But far from the front lines, in a quiet desert base in California, Reginald Denny was fighting a different kind of battle, one against time, disbelief, and the weight of war's endless hunger. The U.S. Army had finally seen the potential of his flying machines. They gave him a contract, not for glory, but for targets. His radio plane OQ-2 drones were now being mass-produced by the hundreds, training young gunners to shoot more accurately before they faced real Luftwaffe fighters. To Denny, it was bittersweet victory. His drones were saving lives, not by fighting, but by teaching others how to survive. Yet deep inside, he knew what these little planes could truly become. He saw in them not just practice tools, but the seeds of something greater. A future where courage didn't have to mean death. His factory grew overnight, buzzing with young workers. Men too old or injured for combat. Women whose hands built the silent machines that might one day protect their brothers overseas. Among them was a young assembler named Norma Jean Duckerty, a shy girl with bright eyes who had fled a broken home and found purpose among the rivets and propellers. No one knew then that she would one day become Marilyn Monroe. But even in those days, under the blinding lights of the radioplane plant, she represented what Denny believed in, that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when history called them. As the radioplane drones rolled off the assembly line, Denny kept dreaming of the next step. He wanted a drone that could think faster, fly farther, strike harder. He wanted something that could enter enemy airspace, deliver a payload, and return. No pilot, no risk, no hesitation. It was an idea decades ahead of its time, a vision that both inspired and terrified the military. They feared what it meant, that machines could replace men. They feared what would happen if an army no longer needed bravery, only circuitry. Still, Denny persisted. He poured every ounce of his wealth, his fame, his sanity into prototypes the military refused to even test. He experimented with small cameras mounted in the nose, transmitting grainy images back to operators miles away. He designed stabilizers and gyroscopes long before autopilot was more than a dream, but the generals shook their heads. "We fight with men, not toys," they said. "There's no honor in machines." Those words cut deep. Denny had once been that man in the cockpit, young and proud, risking everything for his flag. But he had also seen what war did to those men, what was left of them when courage met machinery stronger than flesh. By mid-1944, as the Allies prepared for D-Day, the pressure mounted. The beaches of Normandy would need every advantage, and Denny believed his technology could help. He wrote letters, begged commanders to consider drones for reconnaissance. They dismissed him again, buried his proposals under mountains of red tape. To them, the drone was still just a training tool, useful but not essential. They didn't see what he saw, a machine that could have saved hundreds of lives in the bloody chaos of Omaha Beach. History would never know what might have been. Still, his radio planes found quiet ways to serve. On airfields across the country, soldiers trained their gunnery skills on the buzzing targets. Each one was small, fragile, expendable. Yet behind every flight was a symbol of progress. They were the first unmanned wings of a new era, whispering through the air that the world was changing. Denny watched them take off and vanish into the horizon, the hum of their engines echoing like ghosts. He knew the world wasn't ready for what he had built, but history rarely is. The war ended in 1945, and victory came not through machines, but through unimaginable human cost. Europe lay in ruins, Japan was ashes, and the skies that once swarmed with death fell silent. Reginald Denny returned to his workshop, older, quieter. His fame dimmed, but his purpose unbroken. The newspapers forgot him. The army moved on. But he had done something that no one could take away. He had changed the way mankind looked at flight forever. He had shown that courage could live not just in the hearts of soldiers, but in the minds of those who dared to imagine. In the years that followed, his factory shut down. His name faded from memory, yet his ideas lived on, in secret labs, in government projects, in the whispers of a new kind of warfare being born from the lessons of the last. Engineers studied his designs. Generals revisited his reports. Slowly, the madman's dream began to take form again, not as a curiosity, but as destiny. By the time Denny passed away in 1967, the skies were no longer ruled only by men. The drone, his drone, had become real, unstoppable, inevitable. He would never see the machines that bore his legacy, the reconnaissance aircraft of Vietnam, the unmanned missiles of the Gulf, the precision drones of the 21st century. But every one of them carried his fingerprint. The ghost he had built in 1944 had finally come alive, and the world had caught up to his madness. By the time the guns fell silent and victory banners were draped across the ruined cities of Europe, Reginald Denny should have felt pride. His invention, the radio plane, had played its part in the war effort, saving countless lives through training and innovation. Yet as the world celebrated peace, Denny found himself haunted by a question that refused to fade. What had he truly created? The little machines that once danced through the desert skies like harmless toys had become the blueprint for something larger, colder, and more terrifying. The world had seen what machines could do, and it wanted more. In the months after the war, Denny's workshop became a graveyard of silent dreams. The once bustling radio plane factory stood half empty, its assembly line still coated in dust and oil. The contracts had ended, and the military men who once laughed at his ideas had vanished, replaced by new officials obsessed with nuclear power and rockets. Yet Denny kept working, alone, restless. His eyes, once alive with fire, now carried the exhaustion of a man who had stared too long into the future. The sound of the engines still rang in his ears, the buzzing ghosts of the thousands of drones he'd built. He began to wonder if his machines had been born too soon, or if mankind had always been destined to follow them into a future ruled by automation and fear. He would read the newspapers, stories about tensions rising between East and West, about nations racing to build faster jets, deadlier bombs, new eyes in the sky. Every headline echoed his life's work, twisted into a warning. The world no longer mocked the idea of unmanned flight. Now it was a weapon every superpower wanted. They called them pilotless reconnaissance craft, guided missiles, remote-controlled aircraft. Different names, same heart. Each one carried the ghost of Denny's vision. The very thing he had dreamed of to save lives was becoming a silent predator. The beginning of a new kind of war. He tried to speak out, to tell people what he had intended, but no one listened. The press wanted stories of heroes and victory, not forgotten inventors. Hollywood had moved on without him. He was a relic of a bygone age, the actor who became an engineer, the dreamer who built machines no one wanted to remember. In interviews, when asked about his drones, he smiled faintly and said only, "They were never meant to kill." But inside, he knew what was coming. The seed he had planted was growing, and it would soon bear fruit that would darken the sky. At night, he would walk through the empty hangars, running his hands along the cold metal shells of his old creations. Dust covered their wings like a burial shroud. The silence pressed against him. Once, these rooms had been filled with laughter and the steady rhythm of assembly, bolts tightening, propellers spinning, dreams taking shape. Now only the echoes remained. He thought of the young workers who had once looked up to him, the girl with the bright eyes who became Marilyn Monroe, the young mechanics who had believed they were building something noble. What would they think now if they knew what their work had unleashed? But guilt was not the only thing that haunted him. There was also pride, dangerous, persistent pride. The part of him that had once defied generals and ridicule still whispered that he had been right all along. The future did belong to machines. He had seen it before anyone else. His drones were not monsters. They were the next step in human evolution, the merging of courage and technology. Maybe he hadn't built weapons. Maybe he had built warnings. Proof that humanity could transcend fear if only it learned to wield power with compassion. Yet he knew too well that war rarely listened to conscience. As the Cold War deepened, reports of new unmanned surveillance aircraft began to emerge. Prototypes that could fly across enemy borders, controlled from thousands of miles away. Denny watched from afar, anonymous, invisible, knowing that every line of their design traced back to his first sketch on a Los Angeles workbench. He could almost hear the voices of those old generals dismissing him. Toys for children. How ironic that the toys had become the very thing those men now depended on. But there was no satisfaction in being proven right, only the hollow ache of foresight unheeded. In 1952, Denny visited one of the few remaining radioplane units at a military training base. The soldiers there barely knew his name. They thought he was just another visitor, a quiet old man watching their practice session. But as the small drone lifted into the sky, its propeller slicing through the wind, Denny felt a chill run through him. The same hum, the same trembling wings, the same fragile courage in motion. He realized then that even if history forgot him, the sky would not. Every whirring engine was a whisper of his defiance, proof that one man's dream could outlast an entire generation's disbelief. He returned home that night and sat in silence, his workshop dark except for the faint light of a single lamp. Around him were the remnants of his life's work, blueprints rolled and yellowed, engine parts rusting in boxes, half-built wings suspended from the ceiling, like sleeping bats. He closed his eyes and imagined the first time he had launched one of his creations into the air. The moment the machine had lifted, trembling, unsure, then steady. The joy of that moment returned, fleeting and fragile. He had built something that could fly without fear. Something pure, something that had begun as a symbol of hope before the world twisted it into a shadow. He realized that perhaps invention was never about control, that once an idea was born, it no longer belonged to its creator. It belonged to history, to the choices humanity made with it. And in that realization came peace, bitter and beautiful. He had done what he was meant to do. The rest was beyond him. As the years passed, Denny's health began to fail. But even in his final days, he would still tinker with small model planes. His hands trembling, yet precise. His eyes tracing invisible flight paths across the ceiling. To the nurses who cared for him, he was just an eccentric old man lost in dreams of flying. They never knew that the small aircraft sketched in his notebooks were the ancestors of the most advanced technologies on Earth. The machines he once built with his bare hands would soon circle the globe. Invisible, unstoppable, feared. Reginald Denny died quietly in 1967, his story buried under decades of progress and silence. But the world he left behind was forever changed. The ghost he had built in 1944 still flew, not in the deserts of California, but in every sky where men sent machines to do what they no longer dared to do themselves. And though the world called him a madman, perhaps he was something far greater. A man who saw the future, long before the world was ready to believe it. History rarely remembers its prophets in time. When Reginald Denny died, the world barely noticed. Newspapers gave him a few lines, calling him a Hollywood actor and aviation enthusiast, not the man who had built the first true drone. Yet, as his obituary faded into yesterday's news, the skies above the earth were already echoing with his legacy. In secret hangars from Washington to Moscow, engineers studied blueprints born from his radioplane's design. The same curved wings, the same radio pulse guidance, the same dream of remote flight that he had envisioned 3 decades earlier. The madman who once built toys for soldiers had unknowingly given birth to a revolution that would shape the next century of warfare. In the 1950s, as Cold War paranoia spread like wildfire, the United States and the Soviet Union both began experimenting with unmanned reconnaissance aircraft. Cameras replaced cockpits, antennas replaced pilots. Each new model carried the same ghostly heartbeat, a radio signal whispering across the sky, guiding a metal body through invisible lines of control. They called them spy drones, though in truth they were descendants of Denny's humble radio plane. The OQ-2 had evolved into the Ryan Firebee, then the AQ-M34 Lightning Bug, drones that flew deep into enemy airspace during the Vietnam War, gathering intelligence at impossible altitudes. Every image captured, every mission flown without a pilot's heartbeat, was another echo of Denny's dream. The machines no longer crashed into the desert. They now soared over jungles, oceans, and continents. His ghost had gone global. But with progress came unease. The drone had been born out of compassion, out of Denny's wish to spare young pilots from dying in the sky. Yet as decades passed, the machine that once symbolized protection began to represent distance, the growing gap between human decision and human consequence. The farther the operator stood from the battlefield, the easier it became to forget what the machine's metal wings carried beneath them. Cameras now transmitted live feeds, and missiles could be guided from thousands of miles away. The machine had lost its innocence, and so had mankind. Denny's vision had come true, but at a terrible cost. The very miracle that once saved lives now made killing effortless. Still, innovation marched on, as relentless as time itself. By the 1990s, drones had become the unseen soldiers of modern warfare, silent, patient, tireless. From the deserts of Iraq to the mountains of Afghanistan, unmanned aircraft circled above like mechanical angels and demons alike. Their operators sat in air-conditioned rooms, eyes fixed on glowing screens, hands guiding machines across oceans. The pilots of this new age no longer felt the wind, the fear, or the weight of altitude. They were warriors without wings, bound to Denny's vision yet detached from its soul. And though the world called them the future of combat, the man who dreamed of them had imagined something nobler. Not death from the sky, but safety through invention. In the halls of aviation museums, Denny's name began to resurface. Historians uncovered the forgotten patents, the photographs of him kneeling beside his prototype, the faded labels of the radioplane factory. They pieced together the story of the actor who built the first drone. Visitors stared at the fragile wooden wings and small engine and could scarcely believe that such a humble creation had sparked a technological revolution. But those who truly understood engineering saw something more profound. They saw faith. Faith that technology could protect rather than destroy, that courage could exist in invention as much as in combat. Some even began to call Denny a visionary, the Da Vinci of modern flight. Yet if he could have seen the world he inspired, he might have wept. The same drone concept that once guarded Allied skies now served as a tool of surveillance and power, its presence both invisible and inescapable. It hovered above borders, cities, and oceans, always watching, always ready. His dream had become humanity's double-edged sword, the perfect servant and the perfect threat. The irony was unbearable. The man who built the first drone to save lives had also built the foundation for a technology that could erase them without a trace. And yet, perhaps Denny would have understood. History has always turned invention into contradiction. The same spark that lights a lamp can ignite a war. The same curiosity that builds wings can drop bombs. What matters, he once said in a letter never published, is not what the machine can do, but what the man who holds its controls decides to make of it. Those words would one day be quoted by historians, carved quietly into a memorial plaque at an aviation exhibit in Los Angeles, the city where his dream was born. Few stopped to read it, fewer still understood what it meant. But for those who did, it was a haunting truth. Progress without conscience is merely evolution without humanity. By the dawn of the 21st century, drones had become more advanced than Denny could ever have imagined. Guided by satellites, powered by artificial intelligence, capable of flight so precise that they could strike a single target from the stratosphere. They no longer needed the radio pulse he once tuned by hand. They no longer relied on the trembling fingers of a man in a hangar. But in every circuit, in every design, in every line of code, his spirit endured. The dreamer who once soldered wings together in a dusty California workshop had set something unstoppable in motion. The world had caught up to his madness and surpassed it. And yet, even amid the noise of technological triumph, something of his humanity remained. In museums, old footage of Denny shows him smiling beside his prototype, the wind blowing through his hair, his eyes fixed on the sky. In that frozen moment, you can almost see what he saw. Not war, not destruction, but wonder. The same wonder that has driven every inventor since the dawn of time. The desire to lift humanity higher, to touch the impossible. His dream was not to replace men, but to protect them. And though history would twist that dream into something far darker, the origin of it, the purity of it, remains untarnished. Reginald Denny's life ended in obscurity, but his legacy became infinite. His machine, his ghost of steel and wire, transcended him, spreading across nations, generations, and ideologies. It became a reflection of the human condition itself, brilliant, flawed, and forever reaching beyond its grasp. The skies he left behind are no longer silent. They hum with his legacy, every vibration a reminder that progress always demands a price. But perhaps that was his final lesson. That invention, like courage, is never clean, never safe, and never fully understood until it's too late. When a man's dream outlives him, it often becomes something he never meant it to be. And so it was with Reginald Denny. Long after his hands had turned to dust, the ghost he built in that dim California hangar continued to circle above the earth, a reminder of both the brilliance and blindness of human ambition. But history, as it always does, began to remember. The archives reopened, the photographs resurfaced, and the quiet name that once sat buried beneath the roar of jets returned to light. Denny was no longer a forgotten tinkerer or failed actor. He was the father of unmanned flight, the man who dreamed before the world was ready to see. And in that rediscovery lay a question more haunting than any invention he ever built. What do we owe to our own creations? Every story about war is a story about belief. Belief in courage, belief in purpose, belief that destruction can somehow lead to peace. Denny's story was different. His was not a tale of bombs or bullets, but of faith in ingenuity. The faith that a machine could one day carry the burden of human fear so that men would not have to. Yet humanity, in its hunger for power, took that gift and shaped it in its own image. His dream of saving lives became a system for ending them more efficiently. His hope to remove men from danger became a method to remove men from consequence. That is the paradox that echoes in every revolution. The line between progress and peril is drawn not in metal, but in the human heart. Imagine him now, if he could see the world as it stands today. Drones mapping disaster zones, delivering medicine, rescuing the lost. The same principle that once guided his trembling prototype now saves lives from the ruins of earthquakes and floods. And yet, in the same sky, other drones hover with silent precision, unseen, unfeeling, watching the living through the eyes of a machine. One dream, two destinies. In every invention there is a mirror. Denny's drone shows us what we are capable of, both our compassion and our cruelty. The wings that once carried hope now carry judgment, and every time they rise, we are forced to ask whether we still control the sky, or whether the sky has begun to control us. Reginald Denny never sought immortality. He only wanted to build something beautiful enough to outlast fear. In that, he succeeded. His life reminds us that courage is not only found on battlefields. It can live in solitude, in the mind of one man who dares to build what others cannot yet imagine. His courage was not the kind that faces gunfire, but the kind that faces ridicule, failure, and disbelief. The courage to believe in an idea so fiercely that even history could not erase it. And when the world called him mad, he wore that word like a medal, because every true innovator begins as a heretic in the eyes of his time. If there is a moral to Denny's story, it is not one of invention, but of intention. Machines are only extensions of their makers, reflections of the souls that built them. The first drone was not born evil or noble, it was born human. It carried in its propellers all the contradictions of its creator, his compassion and his pride, his hope and his fear. And that is why his story still matters, because the world he dreamed of has arrived, and we, the inheritors of his madness, must now decide what to do with it. Will we let the ghosts of progress haunt us, or will we finally learn to guide them towards something greater? In the end, Denny's greatest creation was not the drone itself, but the question it left behind, a question that echoes across time, more urgent than ever. Can humanity build something powerful without losing the very humanity that dreamed it? That is the true weight of invention. It is not measured in blueprints or flight hours, but in the morality that anchors it to the ground. And if Denny's ghost still flies, Perhaps it does so not as a warning, but as a whisper, a reminder that even the smallest spark of imagination can ignite the future, for better or for worse. He was called a madman because he dreamed of machines that could fly without fear. But perhaps madness is simply seeing tomorrow more clearly than the rest of us can see today. Denny's dream was not about war, it was about transcendence, about freeing men from their own mortality, one fragile wing at a time. And though time has blurred his name, his lesson remains sharper than ever. That courage is not only the act of facing danger, but of facing the unknown. That genius, stripped of empathy, becomes destruction. That progress without conscience is just another form of surrender. As the engines of modern drones hum across endless skies, they carry the faint echo of his workshop, the smell of oil, the trembling hands, the whisper of a propeller spinning for the first time. They remind us that every invention begins with a man, a dream, and a choice. Reginald Denny made his choice out of love for life, not hunger for power. And though history twisted his dream, it cannot erase the heart that built it. Decades have passed, and yet the hum of Reginald Denny's first drone still vibrates beneath the roar of modern skies. The machines that fill the air today, sleek, intelligent, unblinking, are descendants of that fragile creation born in the dust of a forgotten hangar. When we look up now, we no longer see only clouds and stars. We see the reflection of his madness and his faith, circling above us like a question that never quite lands. The world he dreamed of has arrived, a world where man's reach extends beyond sight, where courage is measured in circuits and command signals, where flight no longer requires wings of flesh. And yet, for all our progress, we are still haunted by the same silence that once surrounded him, the silence of conscience in the face of innovation. In the modern age, the drone has become both savior and specter. It delivers medicine to remote villages, maps the scars of a melting planet, and searches for survivors in the rubble of disaster. It also strikes unseen in the night, its precision measured not by valor but by algorithms. Each mission, each silent descent from the stratosphere, is a dialogue between past and future, between the man who built the first and the world that built too many. Denny's dream was to save the living. Our reality is to control them. And perhaps that is the tragedy that defines every age of invention, that the tools born from hope inevitably learn to serve fear. Yet in some corners of the world, his dream still breathes in its purest form. In classrooms and workshops, young engineers study the blueprints of his radio plane, marveling at the simplicity of its design. They see not a weapon, but a beginning, the first whisper of unmanned flight that dared to defy the limits of human frailty. They build new drones for peace, for exploration, for the fragile hope that machines might finally lift humanity instead of dividing it. In those hands, the spirit of Denny is reborn, not as a soldier, but as a teacher. And though history buried him, it could not bury the hunger that drove him, that restless fire to see what lay beyond the known horizon. Still, every dreamer who builds must live with the shadow of what his creation might become. That is the burden Denny carried in life and the inheritance he left us in death. Technology is a mirror, and in its reflection, we see ourselves, our mercy and our cruelty, our wisdom and our greed. Denny's story is not just about the first drone. It is about the eternal struggle between imagination and morality. He built wings so that men might no longer fall, but he could not stop those wings from learning to kill. That is the cost of vision. Once a dream takes flight, it can never be fully recalled to the ground. In a way, Denny's life reads like scripture for the modern age. He began as an actor, a man who made his living by pretending to be others, and ended as an engineer, a man who created something that would one day act in place of others. The arc of his life is the arc of humanity itself. Our longing to transcend limitation, our impulse to give motion to our will, and our blindness to where that motion leads. His invention asked one question of its time: can courage exist without the risk of death? But the answer that history gave was far more complex. It showed that courage without risk can too easily become control without restraint. If you stand today on the cracked concrete of the old radio plane factory site, there is nothing left but silence. The wind still moves through the empty lot, carrying the faint scent of metal and memory. No plaques mark his name, no statues guard his dream. But if you close your eyes, you can almost hear it. The buzz of a small engine rising into the air, the first trembling attempt of a machine to defy gravity. That sound, fragile yet defiant, is the heartbeat of human ambition. It is the same sound that has followed us from the Wright brothers' field to the space stations orbiting above, from Denny's workshop to the remote control rooms of 1,000 armies. The sound of progress, the hum of faith wrapped in machinery, and maybe, in the quiet between that sound, there is still a chance for redemption. Maybe the same creativity that gave us eyes in the sky can also teach us to look inward, to see the difference between invention and wisdom. Perhaps Denny's ghost still circles above us, not as a warning but as a plea. Remember why I built it. Remember that technology was never meant to replace humanity, only to protect it. Every drone that flies is not a symbol of domination, but a test of whether we can build without forgetting the cost of creation. History often forgets its inventors until the world is forced to confront their legacy. Reginald Denny never lived to see his machine conquer the skies, but he foresaw the heart that would be required to guide it.